From Washington, D.C. to California to New York, this 4th of July in the United States of America was overshadowed by 16 mass shootings, in which 15 people were killed and nearly 100 were injured. What is the reason for this surge in gun violence in the United States of America, and why are Americans divided over stricter gun laws? To talk more on this, we have with us Alon Burstein, Assistant Professor at the University of California, Irvine. Alon, thanks so much for joining us and to give us your insights on this topic.
Thank you for having me on this depressing topic.
Well, thanks for giving us your insights, Alon. My first question to you is, this is not the first time that the 4th of July has been marred with gun violence. Similar incidents also took place last year as well, like we know. Now, the unfortunate question on everyone's mind is, Alon, why is the US so prone to gun violence? What do you think are the factors?
So it's obviously a very complicated question. There's the legal factors, which are historically the Second Amendment, which was ratified in 1791, allows people the right to bear arms. And this has to do with the American Revolution and the idea that the people need to be armed so that the government does not have too much power. That's an ancient idea, but it carries on today because the Constitution, you cannot change that amendment without massive legislation, which we can talk about later. So that's the legal complication, why it's so easy to get guns in the United States and so difficult to legislate against it. Then in recent years, there's been a surge in a lot of gun violence owing to a lot of cultural factors also. The rise of the internet has led to a lot of people to become radicalized, seeing violence, being told that you can become a hero, and in the dark web there's all kinds of things that glorify different types of violence. And really, a lot of different cultural factors also contribute to this rise that we see in people's insecurities that are driving gun violence, as you said, that center around holidays like July 4th, like other holidays in the United States. Unfortunately, during times it used to be about people coming together, we're seeing more people getting enraged and possibly taking out their anger or their psychological frustrations. And because it's so easy to get guns, these two things come together and produce this mass violence.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned the internet and you also talked about insecurity. So the two things usually go hand in hand when we talk about a public health epidemic. Do you think this is what it is right now in the country? It's become a health epidemic?
Absolutely. I mean, and if only it were dealt with the same level of urgency that we saw COVID being dealt with. Ultimately, this year alone, there have been several hundred shootings that have caused deaths of over 400 people and nearly 1,500 people injured. And this is one of the #1 causes of deaths that are not caused by natural causes or sicknesses, which is a whole other issue in the United States. And it's just not dealt with. It's not dealt with as the same level of urgency. It's seen as something that is part of the culture that you just have to accept, in the same way as people don't tend to treat car accidents as something that is a national emergency that you need to deal with, right? When it comes to things like COVID or terrorism, we see that if, a couple of people are killed in a terrorist attack, unfortunately, the entire world will hear about it, depending on where it is. But things like gun violence, as you just mentioned, 15 people killed this weekend, we're not going to see the United States going crazy like it would if it was a terrorist attack or like we saw in response to the COVID pandemic. But it really should be dealt with that way because it is as dangerous and causing far more deaths, if you look at it historically.
Right, that's a stat point there. You mentioned that statistics. It's probably as dangerous, if not more. Why do you think the Americans are against stricter gun laws? You briefly touched upon the fact that it is a part of the culture, but the statistics speak for themselves. They do tell us how many deaths are caused each year. Why do you think they are against gun laws? They aren't against gun laws, I beg your pardon.
So, there's two different things that come together. First of all, like everything in politics today, it's become a very, very divisive point between, in the case of the United States, Republicans and Democrats. Just like everywhere else in the world, everything has become a partisan issue. And the Republican Party has really taken upon itself to preserve people's what they call individual rights. And if their individual rights are to carry a gun, the government should not be allowed to tell them that they can't. And what has happened is a lot of people who themselves do not have guns, themselves might even want stricter gun laws, but if they identify with the Republican Party, then that party is now against gun laws, against any restrictions. So it's really taken that partisan shift. And another side of it, which is bipartisan, goes to both sides, is really what we touched upon a little bit before, this sense of insecurity, right? As gun violence increases, the United States is a huge place. There's a lot of states where there's not that much police presence. And as gun violence increases, more and more people are saying, well, clearly criminals or just people with psychological issues have guns. I want to have a gun too. So those two things come together. Also, if you're on the Republican side of the map, you're almost automatically today against any gun restrictions. And at the same time, even if you're not on the Republican side, because the problem is increasing, more people are saying, well, then I need a gun for my own protection because I'm seeing how much gun violence there is. So those two things come together to just fuel the problem more and more.
Could you explain to us how you bucket Republican side of things and gun laws together? Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Why do you think people with that ideology would want the gun laws to not be removed, probably, or there to not be stricter gun laws?
So historically, the Republican and Democratic Party have changed sides in terms of who tends to support them. But currently, in the last 40 to 50, 60 years, the Republican Party has taken upon itself to advocate what it calls for small government, to say that the federal government, the government sits in Washington, D.C., should not be able to intervene or should intervene as little as possible when it comes to the rights of different states, so the different states in the United States, or individual rights. And that leads to the Republican side to be constantly saying that things that are maybe a national problem, no, but it's not up to the national government. It's up to individual governments or individual people. So that's the big debate about abortion laws, right? The Republican Party does not necessarily say that there should not be abortion should be illegal across the United States. They simply say it should not be the federal government that decides that. It should be every individual state could decide whatever laws they want. And the same goes for gun violence, right? The idea is not that the Republican Party is saying everyone should have a gun. It is simply saying the federal government should not be allowed to restrict individual rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. The Constitution says, Second Amendment, you're allowed to carry guns. Therefore, the federal government should not have anything to say on this matter. And this idea of small government, that the federal government should not intervene or should intervene as little as possible with what happens in individual rights of the states, is really why the Republican Party has thrown its weight into the anti-gun restriction side.
Right, that explains it much better. And unfortunately, I feel I should mention this little data here. There are about 340 mass shooting incidents in the United States of America this year itself. That is a huge figure. Talk to us about how easy it is to access guns in the US. I mean, there's a reason why it's reached that number.
It is unfortunately extremely easy. There are different regulations in different states, but one of the federal restrictions is states cannot outlaw guns. And different cases have been brought to the Supreme Court that have also said states cannot restrict the right, for example, to carry guns in public, something that states used to do in the past. It is exceedingly easy to get a gun in the states. In most of the different states across the United States, you can walk into a Walmart, which is a general store that you have every couple of miles, and there's a section for guns. I am shocked every time I see it, that you could just walk up and buy a gun. Now, usually, different states have some restrictions that they are able to impose. For example, if you're under 21, it's harder to buy a gun. If you have a criminal record, in some states, you're restricted in buying guns, in some states not. If you want to buy what's called assault rifles or semi-automatic weapons, sometimes you need a 15-day waiting period so the police can do a background check. But those are individual restrictions. And you can also go to a state where it's much easier to buy a gun, and then simply travel to another state. So unfortunately, it is exceedingly easy to get a gun in the United States.
Right. Now, I would ask you how it is that violence can be controlled in America, but I think I can also ask you another thing, which will probably give us a better insight into this topic. Joe Biden, in his latest speech, has urged the lawmakers for stricter gun control measures, such as ban on assault weapons, widespread background checks, etc. But talk to us, what are the impediments in implementing these laws?
So you're right; those two questions go together, because
Right.
how could you stop gun violence? So I could say, well, you have to re-educate the entire population that guns kill or they don't really protect, but that's not really going to happen. But you could lead massive legislation, which comes up every time there's a mass shooting that really shocks the United States. So as you said, there's 15 mass shootings occurred these last 3 days. Life is going to continue. But every now and then there's a mass shooting, like if it happens in a school, that all of a sudden shocks the United States. And then there's all kinds of calls upon different parliamentarians and different congresspeople that Congress should come together, do this bipartisan legislation, so find a way that Democrats and Republicans will be able to work together and impose limitations on the federal level on buying guns or assault rifles or things like that. The impediments are that, first of all, the United States has become increasingly divided. Cooperation between Republicans and Democrats is very, very difficult to achieve right now, and especially as we're starting to see the run-up to the next elections with Donald Trump and DeSantis running on one side, Joe Biden on the other side. Republicans would be very hesitant to work with Democrats when you have the rise of Trump again, or DeSantis, or other candidates that are very much against gun control. So that's one impediment. And the other is really this constitutional impediment, because in order to override the Second Amendment, you would have to have such massive legislation in Congress. That's unlikely to happen. So the government really is restricted in what it can do to impose regulations across the United States. What you would need to have is the federal government offering states different incentives, saying, if you restrict guns locally, if you on the state level, which you're allowed to do, say, but in my state, you can try to restrict guns in this way or that way, then the federal government will, and you can fill in the blanks, how they can try to find incentives to help local states do that. But on the federal level, it is becoming increasingly difficult to have cooperation between both sides. And that's unfortunately going to leave us in this stalemate position as more and more gun violence occurs. I'm not optimistic on this one.
Right. Politics can be divisive, I guess, but there is one thing that we are not divided on, which is controlling violence. Thank you so much, Alon, for talking to us on this rather unfortunate and depressing topic and giving us your insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.